We are in lecture 6 and 7 from the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. But my original and inward pollution, that was my plague and my affliction. By reason of that, I was more loathsome in my own eyes than was a toad, and I thought I was so in God's eyes too. Sin and corruption, I said, would as naturally bubble out of my heart as water would bubble out of a fountain. I could have changed heart with anybody. I thought none but the devil himself could equal me for inward wickedness and a pollution of mind. Surely, thought I am forsaken of God, and thus I continued a long while, even for some years together. And now I was sorry that God had made me a man. The beasts, birds, fishes, etc., I blessed their condition, for they had not a sinful nature. They were not obnoxious to the wrath of God. They were not to go to hellfire after death. I could therefore have rejoiced had my condition been as any of theirs. Now I bless the condition of the dog and toad. Yea, gladly would I have been in the condition of the dog or horse, for I knew they had no soul to perish under the everlasting weight of hell or sin, as mine was like to do. Nay, and though I saw this, I felt this, and was broken to pieces with it, yet that which added to my sorrow was, that I could not find with all my soul that I did desire deliverance. My heart was at times exceedingly hard. If I would have given £1,000 for a tear, I could not shed one, no, nor sometimes scarce desire to shed one. I was both a burthen and a terror to myself, nor did I ever so know, as now, what it was to be weary of my life, and yet afraid to die. How gladly I would have been anything but myself, anything but a man, and in any condition but my own. Grace abounding to the chief of sinners, I have printed a number of detached passages continually. Poor patient Bunyan. Like Tolstoy, saw the light again. But we must also postpone that part of his story to another hour. In a later lecture, I will also give the end of the experience of Henry Alline, a devoted evangelist who worked in Nova Scotia 100 years ago, and who thus vividly describes the high watermark of the religious melancholy which formed its beginning. The type was not unlike Bunyan's. Everything I saw seemed to be a burden to me. The earth seemed accursed for my sake. All trees, plants, rocks, hills, and vales seemed to be dressed in mourning and groaning under the weight of the curse, and everything around me seemed to be conspiring my ruin. My sins seemed to be laid open, so that I thought that every one I saw knew them, and sometimes I was almost ready to acknowledge many things, which I thought they knew. Yea, sometimes it seemed to me as if every one was pointing me out as the most guilty wretch upon the earth. I had now so great a sense of the vanity and emptiness of all things here below, that I knew the whole world could not possibly make me happy. No, nor the whole system of creation. When I waked in the morning, the first thought would be, "Oh, my wretched soul, what shall I do? Where shall I go?" And when I laid down, would say, "I shall be perhaps in hell before morning." I would many times look on the beasts with envy, wishing with all my heart I was in their place, that I might have no soul to lose. And when I have seen birds flying over my head, have often thought within myself, "Oh, that I could fly away from my danger and distress. Oh, how happy I should be if I were in their place." and that's from the Life and Journal of the Reverend Mr. Henry Alline, Boston, 1806, page 25 and 26. William James owed his acquaintance with the book to his colleague, Dr. Benjamin Rond. The worst kind of melancholy. Oh, I stopped at the quote, didn't I? Envy of the placid beasts seems to be a very widespread affection in this type of sadness. The worst kind of melancholy is that which takes the form of panic fear. Here is an excellent example for permission to print, which I have to thank the sufferer. The original is in French, and though the subject was evidently in a bad nervous condition at the time of which he writes, his case has otherwise the merit of extreme simplicity. William James translates freely. What he compares to Bunyan, when Bunyan said, There was I struck into a very great trembling, insomuch that at sometimes I could, for days together, feel my very body, as well as my mind, to shake and totter under the sense of the dreadful judgment of God, that should fall on those that have sinned the most fearful and unpardonable sin. I felt also such clogging and heat at my stomach by reason of this my terror, that I was, especially at some times, as if my breastbone would have split asunder. Thus did I wind and twine and shrink under the burden that was upon me, which burden also did so oppress me that I could neither stand nor go nor lie, either at rest or quiet. And the quote. Whilst in this state of philosophic pessimism and general depression of spirits about my prospects, I went one evening into a dressing room in the twilight to procure some article that was there, when suddenly there fell upon me without any warning, just as if it came out of the darkness, a horrible fear of my own existence. Simultaneously there arose in my mind the image of an epileptic patient whom I had seen in the asylum, a black-haired youth with greenish skin, entirely idiotic, who used to sit all day on one of the benches, or rather shelves against the wall, with his knees drawn up against his chin, and the coarse gray undershirt, which was his only garment, drawn over them, enclosing his entire figure. He sat there like a sort of sculptured Egyptian cat or Peruvian mummy, moving nothing but his black eyes and looking absolutely non-human. This image and my fear entered into a species of combination with each other. That shape am I felt. Potentially, nothing that I possess can defend me against that fate. If the hour for it should strike me as it struck for him, there was such a horror of him and such perception of my own merely momentary discrepancy from him, that it was as if something hitherto solid within my breast gave way entirely, and I became a mass of quivering fear. After this, the universe was changed for me altogether. I awoke morning after morning with a horrible dread at the pit of my stomach, and with a sense of the insecurity of life that I never knew before, and that I have never felt since. It was like a revelation, and although the immediate feelings passed away, the experience has made me sympathetic with the morbid feeling of others ever since. It gradually faded, but for months I was unable to go out into the dark alone. Rubber shoes. In general, I dreaded to be left alone. I remember wondering how other people could live, how I myself had ever lived, so unconscious of that pit of insecurity beneath the surface of life. My mother in particular, a very cheerful person, seemed to me a perfect paradox in her unconsciousness of danger, which you may well believe I was very careful not to disturb by revelations of my own state of mind. I have always thought that this experience of melancholia of mine had a religious bearing. On asking this correspondent to explain more fully what he meant by these last words, the answer he wrote was this: I mean that fear was so invasive and powerful that if I had not clung to scripture texts like the eternal God is my refuge, etc. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, etc. I am the resurrection and the life, etc. I think I should have grown really insane. For another case of fear, equally sudden, see Henry James's Society of the Redeemed Form of Man, Boston, 1879, page 43. There is no need of more examples. The cases we have looked at are enough. One of them gives us the vanity of mortal things, another the sense of mortal things, another thing the sense of sin, and the remaining one describes the fear of the universe. And in one or other of these three ways, it always is that man's original optimism and self-satisfaction get leveled with the dust. In none of these cases was there any intellectual insanity or delusion about matters of fact. But were we disposed to open the chapter of really insane melancholia, with its hallucinations and delusions, it would be a worse story still. Desperation, absolute and complete, the whole universe coagulating about the sufferer into a material of overwhelming horror surrounding him without opening or end. Not the conception or intellectual perception of evil, but the grisly, blood-freezing, heart-palsying sensation of it close upon one, and no other conception or sensation able to live for a moment in its presence. How irrelevantly remote seem all our unusual refined optimisms and intellectual and moral constellations in presence of a need of help like this. There is the real core of the religious problem. Help! Help! No prophet can claim to bring a final message unless he says things that will have a sound of reality in the ears of victims such as these. But, well, most of what people claim is final prophet stuff is not what the individual claimed, the conservative tradition. Like that line in the book of Revelations, right? Um, well, that book was written before at least 3 of the canonical Gospels, written before the book of Acts, etc., and it really, from what you see, was only about this guy wrote a book and warned people about adding or subtracting from it. And you can kind of put that warning on all dreams, can't you? That you don't, well, to an extent anyways. But the deliverance must come in as strong a form as the complaint, if it is to take effect, and that seems a reason why the coarser religions, revivalistic, orgiastic, with blood and miracles and supernatural operations, may possibly never be displaced. Some constitutions need them too much, or like them too much is more the thing, right? Arrived at this point, we can see how great an antagonism may naturally arise between the healthy-minded view of living life and the way that takes all this experience of evil as something essential. To this latter way, the morbid-minded way, as we may call it, healthy-mindedness, pure and simple, seems unspeakably blind and shallow. To the healthy-minded way, on the other hand, the way of the sick soul seems unmanly and diseased, with their grubbing in rat holes instead of living in delight, with their manufacture of fears and preoccupation with every unwholesome kind of misery. There is something almost obscene about these children of wrath and cravers of a second birth. If religious intolerance and hanging and burning could again become the order of the day, there is little doubt that, however it may have been in the past, the healthy-minded would at present show themselves the less indulgent party of the two. Well, the peak of Ku Klux Klan's strength was yet to come in the 20s, right? And there's, of course, that stuff about World War II and one, really. But the secular tinge is maybe things even worse than this so-called religious thing, really. Conservatism, really. Oh, hey. In our own attitude, not yet abandoned of impartial onlookers, what are we to say of this quarrel? It seems to me that we are bound to say that morbid-mindedness ranges over the wider scale of the experience, and that its survey is the one that overlaps. The method of averting one's attention from evil and living simply in the light of good is splendid as long as it will work. It will work with many persons. It will work far more generally than most of us are ready to suppose. And within the sphere of its successful operation, there is nothing to be said against it as a religious solution. But it breaks down infinitely as soon as melancholy comes, and even though one might be quite free from melancholy oneself, there is no doubt that healthy mindedness is inadequate as a philosophical doctrine, because the evil facts which it refuses positively to account for are a genuine portion of reality, and they may after all be the best key to life's significance, and possibly the only openers of our eyes to the deepest levels of truth. The normal process of life contains moments as bad as any of those which insane melancholy is filled with, moments in which radical evil gets its innings and takes its solid turn. The lunatic's visions of horror are all drawn from the material of daily fact. Our civilization is founded on the shambles, and every individual existence goes out in a lonely spasm of helpless agony. If you protest, my friend, wait till you arrive there yourself. To believe in the carnivorous reptiles of geologic times is hard for our imaginations. They seem too much like mere museum specimens, yet there is no tooth in any one of those museum skulls that did not dally through long years after the foretime hold fast to the body, struggling in despair of some fated living victim. Forms of horror just as dreadful to their victims, if on a similar spatial scale, fill the world about us today. Here on our very hearths and in our gardens, the infernal cat plays with the panting mouse, or holds the hot bird fluttering in her jaws. Crocodiles and rattlesnakes and pythons are, at this moment, vessels of life, as real as we are. Their loathsome existence fills every minute of every day that drags its length along, and whenever they or other wild beasts clutch their living prey, the deadly horror which an agitated melancholiac feels is the literally right reaction on the situation. For example, from Lutfullah, a Muslim gentleman, Leipzig, 1857, page 112, and maybe it says Mohammedan in the thing, but that's not the right word. But anyways, the example is, it was about 11 o'clock at night, but I strolled on still with the people. Suddenly, upon the left side of our road, a crackling was heard among the bushes. All of us were alarmed, and in an instant a tiger, rushing out of the jungle, pounced upon the one of the party that was foremost, and carried him off in the twinkling of an eye. The rush of the animal and the crush of the poor victim's bones in his mouth, and his last cry of distress, "Ho hi!" involuntarily re-echoed by all of us, was over in 3 seconds, and then I know not what happened till I returned to my senses, when I found myself and my companions lying down on the ground as if prepared to be devoured by our enemy. The sovereign of the forest, I find my pen incapable of describing the terror of that dreadful moment. Our limbs stiffened, our power of speech ceased, and our hearts beat violently, and only a whisper of the same "ho hi" was heard from us. In this state we crept on all fours for some distance back, and then ran for life with the speed of an Arab horse for about half an hour, and fortunately happened to come to a small village. After this, every one of us was attacked with fever, attended with shivering, in which deplorable state we remained till morning. And it may indeed be that no religious reconciliation with the absolute totality of things is possible. Some evils indeed are ministerial to higher forms of good, but it may be that there are forms of evil so extreme as to enter into no good system whatsoever. and that in respect of such evil, dumb submission or neglect to notice is the only practical resource. This question must confront us on a latter day, but provisionally and as a mere matter of program and method, since the evil facts are as genuine parts of nature as the good ones, the philosophic presumption should be that they have some rational significance, and the systematic healthy-mindedness, failing as it does to accord to sorrow, pain, and death any positive and active attention, whatever is formally less complete than systems that try, at least, to include these elements in their scope. The completest religions would therefore seem to be those in which the pessimistic elements are best developed. Buddhism, of course, and Christianity are the best known to us of these. They are essentially religions of deliverance. The man must die to an unreal life before he can be born into the real life. In my next lecture, I will try to discuss some of the psychological conditions of this second birth. Fortunately, from now onward, we shall have to deal with more cheerful subjects than those which we have recently been dwelling on. And we do find, well, some of the stuff about filth and tearing clothes and not wearing clothes and all sorts of, and burying yourself in ashes and all that sort of stuff. Some of that stuff you find in a lot of what's claimed to be scripture. Not so much, but you definitely do have answers of things aren't going so well on the material plane. People aren't accepting the message so much. But then again, the prophet figure kind of would set the example of when things would be good, regardless, right?